Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Director of the Lloyd Library. Tonight's program, Friend or Foe, the story of the invasive Callery Pear tree. I'd like to welcome you. Looking at books on plants and nature in our collection, it becomes clear that our understanding of plants and what we value about a given plant or tree has changed over time, especially over centuries. With the Callery Pear tree and concepts about native plants and invasive species, this shift has occurred much more rapidly. In fact, in most of our lifetimes. Teresa Cully is a plant biologist and professor and head of the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. She's a leader in the fight to reduce the impacts of invasive plants in natural areas. She's a member of the Ohio Invasive Plant Council and on the Ohio Invasive Plant Advisory Committee. She also works with the Midwestern Invasive Plant Network on a communication platform on plants escaping cultivation as sentinels of plant invasion. And I have to say, Teresa, when you described it that way, that was really enlightening to me to sort of think about it in those terms. As many of you know, Ohio is the first state to ban commercial sale and distribution of the Callery pear tree, something we can be proud of, and also thank Teresa for her role in making that happen. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Teresa Cully. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. One thing I'm going to do just real quickly is to see if I can change that. Now we'll just leave it there. So today I'm going to be talking, like Patricia said, about the Callery pear tree, Pyrus calleryana. So I've entitled this From Friend to Foe, because we're going to be talking about how this tree was introduced to the United States with the best of intentions as our friend, and then as maybe you know, or you will know in a few more days, when you see this thing blooming along the highways, it is a little bit of a foe. So let's just go right into it. I want to let you know I welcome questions. We'll have some time, hopefully plenty of time at the end. So oftentimes when we think about the Callery pear, first we need to talk about what it actually is. And so this is pictures taken around where I live, my poor neighbors. But we're talking about Pyrus calleryana. A lot of people know about this as the Bradford pear, the Aristocrat pear, Cleveland Select. These are all different types of the Callery pear, as we'll be talking about in a moment. These are all known as cultivated varieties or cultivars. So this is what we're talking about, all of these types of trees, this particular species. And so very common in early spring, you can see it's planted all over the place. One of the most popular landscaping trees, probably about 10 years ago. So there's a lot of that. So you see it around people's houses. This is the Target near where I live. Joe Boggs took some of these pictures. He and I end up at the same places. And so this is one of his images, and you can see the tree planted in the parking lot. Very, very common. Nowadays, though, we've seen, if you drive around, you see these wild pears here popping up along the roadway. Again, not planted. They really shouldn't be there, but they're popping up. So a lot of people will see that and be like, oh, that's so beautiful. We didn't have to plant it. This is so the win-win. We're going to be talking a little bit about that's not quite a win-win. But that's what we look like. They look like there. Here's a little closer view. You can sort of see them popping up among the honeysuckle. We'll be talking about this in a little bit too. Here's another picture. Yeah, and you can just sort of see them. I think this is somewhere in Kentucky when I was driving around. I drive my family crazy because I'm constantly like trying to take pictures outside the window. But you can, this is a great picture because you could just see a whole cluster of them. Anytime you see this, by the way, what it probably means is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of little saplings, little seedlings below that. These will bloom in usually their third year or older. So anytime you see flowering pear trees, it means there's a whole bunch more that you're not seeing underneath. And so this is one of my favorite sites, if you can call this a favorite site. This is off of the 75 freeway in Liberty Township, near where I live. We'll get back to this in a moment, but I want just you to see how dense this population of wild pear can be. Here it is also in late fall. We start to see it because a lot of the wild pear has a red coloration, the leaves, before they drop. And so that could be a pretty good sign there, again, that you have an infestation of wild Callery pear. So as we talk about this, we need to just review the process of invasion. So when we talk about invasive species, usually we're thinking a non-native species that usually came from somewhere else. It was imported into an area. And then over time, what happens is it establishes. And so that means it just is sort of hanging out there. The populations might be, you might see one or two individuals in the woods. It's not that much of a problem. Some species then undergo what we call a lag period where they're just hanging out there. And this could be a period of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, sometimes even 100 years. Nothing much is happening. And most species, I should be clear, sort of stay in that route. What I'm interested as a scientist, because I'm curious, I like weird, strange things. And so some species suddenly come out of this lag period and start to spread. As a scientist, I want to know why. That's weird. So we want to know what's going on. That's what we're going to be talking about with the Callery pear. But if spread continues, eventually you're going to have so many populations, they're going to start to disturb the ecology. They could mess up with birds, other plants, those types of things. And then over time, if nothing's not done, you start to have human impacts. What this looks like in Western states, for example, you have invasive plants that take over the rangelands, and then the cattle can't use them anymore. And so that's an example of a human impact. So again, I want to emphasize that not all introductions become problems. It's actually a small minority of introductions of non-native plants that are problems. But I would argue that those that become an issue, like the Callery pear, are a big issue. The other thing I want to be clear is that when we're talking about invasive, it is not equivalent with non-native or introduced. Sometimes I hear from people and they say, oh, it's non-native. That means by definition, it's introduced. I mean, it's invasive. But just like I told you, not all introductions become problems. So that's what we're thinking about. So I've become really interested over time in plants that become invasive, but they have an ornamental origin or ornamental use previously. And this is purely because I'm a gardener. I like to plant things. As gardeners, we always like to have something unusual, or you can be proud of something that came from another area and it's growing well in your location. But it also turns out something interesting. Many of the traits that we as gardeners want for horticulture are also the same types of traits that we see in invasive species. So if you think about this, if you're a gardener, you want to grow something that you can't kill, especially if you do not have a green thumb, right? So you want something that we call wide ecological tolerance. That's very hardy. In other words, it can grow anywhere. We want something that grows really quickly. Everyone wants a tree that you can plant and 5 years later, it's a big, huge like oak. It's not going to happen. But we might want something that looks beautiful, prolific flowering, and the Callery pear is a great example of that. And some people want to have a tree or a plant that can produce seeds or fruits for wildlife. We like to attract wildlife to our gardens, and I love to do that as well. The other thing that's really interesting is a lot of invasive plants and animals, by the way, have a history of multiple introductions. And so an example is, this is one that's going to come back, is the European starling, which is all over the place. And it took someone intentionally trying to introduce that bird several times into Central Park in New York City in order for it to take. And so if we think about plants and gardening and horticulture, if you think about that, plants can be produced and introduced multiple times through the ornamental pathway, because you can buy a particular plant many different places and sometimes in different states all across the United States. Okay, so let's talk about the Callery pear. I'm going to talk about the history. I'm actually not going to start with the Callery pear itself, Pyrus calleryana. I'm going to shift a little bit, and we're going to talk about Pyrus communis. And so Pyrus communis is the normal edible pear, like Bartlett. If you go to the store and you get that, that's what we're talking about. Now, many of those pears actually come from the northwestern United States, the West Coast, is where a lot of the pear orchards are. And this is an example of Oregon State in 1918. They have all these pear trees, and you can see people harvesting them. So around this time period, on the West Coast, there was a horrible thing that happened, and that is the occurrence of fire blight. Fire blight is a bacterial disease that infects these trees, and if left untreated over time, will actually kill them. And so the characteristic is you see what they call a shepherd's crook. So the new growth actually curves down, and then it sort of dies back, as you can see there. So this was a problem because this is a huge economic crop that brings in a whole bunch of money to the United States in the early 1900s. So the USDA had to do something. What they decided to do was they wanted to go back to China because a lot of the Pyrus species actually come from China. And their idea was, let's go back to the origin where we got Pyrus communis, and let's see if there's any relatives that might exhibit natural fire blight resistance. And if so, hey, let's bring them to the United States. We can do some crossing, and ideally we can allow fire blight resistance to now show up to be bred into Pyrus communis, and that solves our whole fire blight problem. So that was the idea. So what the USDA did was, again, they're trying to find a source. And so what they, again, focused on is Pyrus calleryana, because there was some evidence that Pyrus calleryana was naturally fire blight resistant. And so the other point I want to make here with this map is essentially they had an explorer who started out in North America, traveled all the way, you see I'm having fun with PowerPoint, over to China. And the other thing I want you to note is that the US here and China are both in the Northern Hemisphere, but as you'll see in another figure here in just a bit, they're at the similar latitudes. So what this means is that any plants in China actually are pretty well adapted for the US. We have very similar microclimates and everything. And so that's why a lot of our invasive species, by the way, actually come from China. Think amber honeysuckle, all these different things. You might ask, what happens to our species? Do they get over to China? And the answer is yes. So in China, there's actually some invasive species that are native to North America. So we're sort of exchanging those. So that's the idea. The USDA, again, is saying, okay, we need to go back to China. We need to try to find this particular species, Pyrus calleryana. So they have a bunch of plant explorers, and the one that's important here is Frank Meyer. So Frank, you could read a little bit more. There's this book, and you guys, it was here at the Lloyd. This is one of my favorite books, but it's called Frank Meyer, Plant Hunter in Asia. And it talks all about him. He was sort of an introverted guy who just really liked to collect plants. And so he was perfect for this. So the USDA would send him on these forays, on these surveys over a multi-year period. And by the way, he is the one who is responsible for the Meyer lemon, you know, the lemons named after him. He brought back a whole bunch of different types of fruit trees to the United States. And so that was his contribution. But one of the things he did was he found the Pyrus calleryana. He also would write these very detailed letters back to David Fairchild and other famous folks, and they would write back. He kept meticulous notes. He had his own photographs. He had his own travel journals. So we have a really good idea of where he went, what he did. So here's one of the pictures that he took of Pyrus calleryana growing naturally in China. Now, remember I told you about how China and the US overlap, and this is just another picture here showing in terms of latitude and well, even longitude. What I have here in back is China, and I've colored in the darker charcoalish color, the native range of the Callery pear in China. And you could see if you lay that right on top of the United States, what we're going to see is that a lot of the pear actually really love to be in the southern US, which is actually what's happened. And now they're moving, as you'll see in a moment. So you can almost think of the species Pyrus calleryana just being perfect. It just needs to be introduced into a new area, and you know, it makes sense that it would take off. Again, Frank Meyer left us these wonderful images. These are pictures that he took. And this is a letter, and I love this. I just want to read a little bit about this to you. And this is from the actual letter he sent. So he says, Pyrus calleryana is simply a marvel. So he's really taken with this. One finds it growing under all sorts of conditions. Okay, my warning bell is going off as an invasive biologist, right? He says one time on dry, sterile mountain slopes, then again with its roots in standing water at the edge of a pond, sometimes in open pine forest, and then again among scrub on a bluestone ledges in the burning sun, and then sometimes in the bamboo jungle, and he's going on and on. It gets in all these places. So, okay, interesting, but now the other question I get is what happens to the tree in China? Does it act the same there as here? And he tells us, so he says, the tree is nowhere found in groves, always in scattered specimens, and but very few large trees were seen. And he has an explanation. There are reasons for that, namely the natives, what he called the indigenous people, cut down the larger specimens for their lumber, from which fine furniture is made, while if a young tree occurs at a suitable place, it is most oftentimes used as stock for an improved variety of pear. Essentially, they cut it and they graft on another pear right onto that. We'll talk about in a moment. So again, he loves this thing. Everyone was like, you can grow anywhere. This is going to be great as a tree that you can bring back and breed in those traits in the United States to our Pyrus communis. And so what he did was he sent back tons of bags, kilograms of bags of seeds. And that was a feat in itself, as I'll show you in a moment. Then what the USDA did was they planted those seeds at different sites, and they had in Glendale, Maryland, at the USDA plant introduction station, they planted a whole bunch of these seeds. They would grow up and they'd be testing them for fire blight resistance. And John Creech was one of the, I think he was the director of the station. And he was out one day in a field of these little seedlings. And he saw one that was really attractive. Now, what I haven't told you is that the seedlings, the plants in China normally have thorns. We call them thorns. And that's what it looks like. Technically, it's not a thorn, it's called a spur, but that's what they normally have. And so he saw this, well, I think it was more of a sapling. He kept his eye on it for a few years. It got older and older, and it didn't have any of these thorns or spurs. And he thought, that's a pretty attractive tree. And that might be something that someone wants to plant in their yard. And so he kept his eye on it. And then eventually he decided, I'm going to clone it. And I'm going to test this out. And so what he did was he planted this tree in a neighborhood just around the corner. Now, again, these are all clones of the one tree at Glendale, Maryland. And so these eventually became known as the Bradford. And so this is my neighbor's Bradford before it got blown over. So we can still find the Bradford today. The Bradford has no central leader for the most part. You can sort of see the branches just sort of grow like this. And so it's more of a bubble tree, or I call it a lollipop tree. And if you're wondering what happened to the main Mama Bradford tree in Glendale, she was there for several different decades, and eventually she was apparently bulldozed down to make room for a parking lot. So she's gone. All right. Then you could start to see the tree. It became very popular. It was about 1961 when the Bradford first was released ornamentally. People could buy it, and it became very popular. And so now you see it all different places. Here's the United States Botanical Garden. When I was there a few years ago, of course, this is in Washington, D.C., and they have a Bradford pear, and you can sort of see it's right listed there, Pyrus calleryana. The one thing you'll notice here is a branch has fallen off, which is going to become important. I was on the opposite side of the country in California. I was at the Winchester Mystery House, which is a really weird house, if you've ever been there. It was built by the wife of the man who invented the Winchester rifle. And so she felt guilt, he died. And so she felt that the spirits kept telling her to keep building on her house in order to, if they didn't, everyone who was killed by the Winchester rifle would come and hurt her. Anyways, right there, you could see the Bradford pear right in California. So on both sides of the country. Then this is getting back to my neighborhood. One of the problems that people started to see with the Bradford is about 15 to 20 years, the tree essentially branches fall off. And this might be in a windstorm, it might be in a snowstorm, it might be in an ice storm. And so this is typically what you see. Again, the Bradford, the problem is there's no central leader. So eventually, if you don't prune it properly, it just sort of, and so this would happen. And here's more. Got to a point where in my neighborhood, whenever there was a big storm or a windstorm, my whole family, we would hop in the car where we'd take the dog and go walking around. I'm with my camera taking pictures. My neighbors probably hate me. And here's another one that's really beautiful, but what you don't see is like in the middle right there, a whole branch has fallen off. Okay, and then this is my favorite. So this is after Hurricane Ike came through years ago. And this is the entrance to my subdivision, and the whole thing just essentially self-destructed, right? It's gone. Here's another one of my other neighbors. And the interesting thing here is this is a really beautiful tree. And what they've done here, and you can't really see it, but they've actually, go back one here. They've rigged up a whole system of belts to hold it together. So, and this is another tree. I just thought this was interesting. This is 2014. We had a really weird season and it was snowing when the tree was blooming. And I'm now worried that's going to happen again this season because everything's weird. Okay, so because these Bradford pears, people really love this tree. You can grow it anywhere. It's so beautifully white in the early spring, which by the way smells horribly. If you've ever smelled the thing, I personally think it smells horribly. But people wanted better trees. And so the plant breeders and developers started to find other trees. And so they developed a whole different number of these cultivated varieties that I mentioned earlier. So here's a few. So Bradford, Aristocrat, Cleveland Select, Chanticleer, Fari. Fari is a little dwarf one. Autumn Blaze, you can see obviously in the autumn, beautiful fall coloring. Capital, which is really much a column to grow upwards, ideally between power lines. And then Respire, White House, and more lately we have not the Bradford, but the new Bradford. So there's all these different ones coming out. There's probably today, probably about 40 to 50 different varieties that have been released to date, probably more, honestly. There seems to be more coming out. So it's really important to talk about, again, how these cultivars are produced. Remember, I told you about how the Bradford, all those came from the same mother tree. And so what John Creech did was he would cut off essentially branches or little parts of the stem of the tree. And then the cool thing with plants, not all plants, but with this species in particular, a lot of fruit trees, is you can do grafting. So animals, you can't do this, obviously, right? So here what we're going to do is we can grow up a little Callery Pear, a little seedling, and we're going to just cut it, throw off the top. And then what you could do is you get the piece that you want from the Bradford or from Aristocrat called the scion, and you can cut that and you just put it right on the cut part of your rootstock. You can bind it together, and if you do it right, the vascular system grows right into one another. And so then you get a tree where the top part technically is from one tree, the one you want, and the bottom piece, the rootstock, is genetically really a whole different tree that you've just meshed them together. Okay. And this is going to become very important in our story. So the point here is that the scion, the upper part, and the rootstock, the lower part, are not the same thing. In other words, they are not genetically identical. Okay, we're going to dive a little bit more deeper into the flower. Beautiful plant. I will not disagree. The anthers here, you can see they're sort of cool. They have 2 sets of 10 anthers. So the first set sort of unfurl, and then the second set eventually unfurl too, over probably about 2 to 3 days. So really beautiful. But what's interesting about the Callery Pear, which is important to our story, is something that also is very similar in other fruit species. This is called self-incompatibility. And specifically here, it's called gametophytic self-incompatibility. This is the reason why if you want to grow blueberries or even apple trees or apricots or anything like that, they always suggest you need to have more than one. You need to have 2 or 3. And it's because essentially these fruit species cannot pollinate themselves. And so let me explain it a little bit to you. All right, we're going to have pollen that comes from one tree, and that's going to be our pollen parent. And we're going to have the fruits and the seeds that come from another tree, who's going to be our maternal parent, our mom. And so each pollen grain is haploid, meaning it has half the genetic information of the mom. The mom is like us, we're diploid. And so the pollen, you can have a situation where if you look at the pollen genotype, you have different alleles, they're called different forms of genes that are in the pollen. So say we have two pollen grains. In our first example here, one has an S1 pollen, the other has an S2. If we look at the mom, she's diploid, so she gets two copies. She also has S1 and S2. Now the rule here is if a pollen grain has the same S allele as the mom, the pollen tube can't grow. It's just enzymes trim it off. They can't do it. So in this first case of an incompatible cross, the S1 and S2 pollen grains start to grow, and then the mom actually recognizes it, and boom, they're cut off. And so there's no seeds. Now, the semi-compatible one, we have S1 and S2 pollen grains. The mom now is S1, S3 right here. And you can see now the S1 pollen grain can't grow, it's cut off, it matches in the mom, but now the S2 is different from it's not found in the mom's mixture here. So that is like a half cross. A fully compatible is where now we have an S1, S2 pollen grains, but the mom is completely different. She's S3, S4, it could be anything. In this case, the pollen tubes can grow. So what I'm trying to show you here is that if we have a Bradford trying to cross with another Bradford, they're the same thing. You have the first case, it can't cross-pollinate. But if we have the Bradford, say, as the mom still, and now we have, I don't know, Cleveland Select as the dad, they're different enough where now we could get a semi-compatible cross or a fully compatible. And so this is what is really important. This is what's driving part of this answer for why is the species invasive. So originally when everyone were planting their Bradfords, there was no fruits, no big deal. Suddenly, as more and more people started to replace their Bradfords with other more improved varieties of Callery Pear, they all started to cross-pollinate, and then you get the fruits. Now, just a reminder, here we're talking pear fruits. This is what they look like for the Callery Pear versus Pyrus communis we just talked about, the bigger one. So I've talked to some people and they say, oh, my pear tree doesn't produce fruits. Now they're thinking big, huge Bartlett, right? And I say, oh, no, it's actually the small little marble-sized fruits. And you see their face just go, oh, I thought those were like aborted ones. And I'm like, no. So these smaller fruits have anywhere from usually 2 to 10 seeds each. And then you can multiply, I'm just right here, you can do the math and then figure out the whole tree. And so these things are pumping out hundreds of, thousands and thousands of seeds per season. So they're really, really prolific. What happens to those seeds? That's another part of the story. So remember the European starling I told you about? Came over from Europe by someone who brilliantly thought he wanted to introduce all birds of William Shakespeare into North America. So he worked really hard at doing it into Central Park, and hence the English sparrow as well. So now we know, we've seen evidence that the European starling is the thing that's eating these seeds. And by the way, in the winter, if you've ever seen these huge flocks of birds flying around, those are the European starlings. So they shouldn't be here, but they are, so they eat the seeds. The other thing more recently, there's been evidence that the cedar waxwing actually also has been eating the seeds. I should mention that these birds won't typically eat them right in early fall or early winter, late fall, early winter. They tend to go for other more juicier type of seeds, and it's only later in the winter when there's nothing left, then they'll actually turn and eat the seeds of Pyrus calleryana. So what happens then, the birds are eating the seeds, flying out, and oftentimes perching along telephone lines along the roadways. And so that explains why we start to see Callery Pear along the roadways. So this is an example of Butler County where I live. And this is actually, if any of you know the area, this is Tylersville. This is the 75. There's a Meyer down here. This used to be a nursery, and now I think it's a Bank of America or something. It got redone. But what happened was they had planted a few Callery Pears here purposely. And then you can see all these white things all over and all around this gas station right here. That's all wild Callery Pear. Just went crazy. So that's what we're looking at if we were looking from above. So again, the birds are just dispersing these seeds all over the place. Here's another view. This is a fun, oh, this is that site I showed you, the huge dense population. So this is the 75 freeway right here. This is in Liberty Township. This is Bethany Road. And so I was always curious, like, what the heck is going on? So you see these residential area over here, they plant the Callery Pear in their yards, but then what the heck is going on here? If you overlay this with a county auditor's map and you look at the plots, you can see this whole plot right here. It's all one thing of Callery Pear. When I asked around, people said, oh, we think what happened was when they built this road for Bethany Road, I've heard both things. They pulled dirt out of there to make the bridge area, or they put dirt back in. Anyways, there's a major disturbance of the dirt. So I think that's probably a really good reason why we have this huge, nasty, group right there. And it's probably because seeds were coming out from the residential area over here. So what happened was, I literally stumbled across a wild Callery Pear with a friend, Margie Becus, who some of you might know. And we didn't know what it was. And she said, oh, it looks like something in my yard. And so one thing led to another. And I ended up being at a conference like in Delaware or somewhere the next week. And I just mentioned this to someone. And they said, oh, yeah, on these gardening forums, people are talking about this Callery Pear. And probably it came from cultivars in the area. And so I looked it up. And sure enough, on gardening forums, people are talking about this, like in Maryland. But yet, when you look at the scientific literature, there's nothing. So I thought, this is strange, and I like weird, strange things. So we decided to take a stab, use some of our scientific tools and try to figure out what's going on. So again, we're trying to figure out, is the mix of the cultivars the problem? And so what we did was a bunch of different projects. One is we did hand crossing studies. And so we very carefully took flowers of plants that I bought from Home Depot and filled my lab, which smelled horribly, by the way. And we would pull off the anthers, so we'd emasculate the plants, the flowers, so they can't self-pollinate. And then we would take pollen from the same plant and put it on there, or pollen from a different individual of the same cultivar, like another Bradford, for example, or we grab pollen from a totally different cultivar. And then we also, for kicks, grab pollen from a wild population. And then just went to see, did fruits develop? And sure enough, as the fruits develop, you can sort of see this part, you see it swell up, and then eventually you have a fruit. So what we found out was really consistent with this whole gametophytic self-incompatibility system I just told you about. So essentially, when we use a Bradford as a maternal parent, really any plant as a maternal parent, if you looked at percent fruit set, if you use pollen from the same plant, 0% fruits, nothing. If you use pollen from another individual of the Bradford of the same cultivar, nothing. Then you grab pollen from a totally different cultivar and it's essentially 100% fruit set, full fruit set. And then when you grab it from wild plants, we had two populations. One I just called Benedict. You'll see that population in a moment. And one that was on the I-71 freeway. And you could sort of see it's approaching 100%. So again, this is consistent with the idea that you need to have different cultivars together in order to have fruit production. If you just have one cultivar, you get nothing. So then we wanted to take it a little bit further and say, hey, we're in a lab, we can do some genetic analysis. And so we would get a leaf from a tree, bring it back to the lab, grind it up. Here, one of my first students, undergrad Ann Wick, is sitting here grinding it up. And then you do a bunch of steps and you extract the DNA. That's in this little tube. The DNA essentially looks like snot, if you've never seen it before. And then you could do some genetic tests with that, run it through a sequencer and all sorts of things. And it can tell you a lot about that particular tree. In fact, for us, we're able to use the DNA to identify exactly what cultivar someone had in their yard. So this is an example. This is using what are known as microsatellite markers, little repeated sections of DNA. But here what we can see is that with the Aristocrat, I'm gonna see if I can do this. Oop, nope, I'll do it here. This is just little sections of DNA. We can run it. And for this sample above here, we can see it has two little peaks. And that means it's an Aristocrat. It's a 279 and 272, it looks like. This one has a 279 peak, but now it's a 264. And this one essentially really has two copies. These always have two because they're diploid. So this has a double dose of 267. So this is just an example. We can run out the DNA, look at what the peaks say and say, oh yeah, that's this cultivar or that cultivar. So if you've heard me talk before, you might have seen this part, but I think it's really important here. And so what we did was we went around to a bunch of nurseries. We pulled leaves off of their trees that had a label on them, said Bradford. So we pulled off a leaf. We noted, okay, this is Bradford. And then we ran the genetics. What this graph here is showing you is that each bar here is one plant. And so it's color coding it, it's grouping them together to say, okay, what ones have the same genetics behind them versus not. So what you can see, first of all the plants that we sampled in the different places that were labeled Aristocrat all came out together. They're all yellow, they're all the same. Okay, that's the Aristocrat genotype. And then you can look capital, oh, look at capital is all the same. Okay, so individuals within a cultivar are usually genetically identical. But you're probably already noting that there's weirdness happening. So we have cases here of Bradford, and you can see we have a bunch of trees that are blue, which are the true Bradford. And then suddenly we have 3 trees that are actually Aristocrat, but are being sold as Bradford. And then you have a Respire over here that's being sold as a Bradford, which is weird because actually Bradford is the cheaper one. That was weird. So it turns out about 12% of cultivars are sometimes sold mislabeled. And some of the big box stores were the problem here. And then the other thing you'll notice that's a little odd is that Chanticleer, Cleveland Select, Stonehill, and Fari, that's that little dwarf one, they're all the same. They're all grouping together. Genetically, I can tell you they are identical. And so I was like, this is weird. And so we reran, we were like, we must have mixed something up. We must have, screwed up the labeling or something. We ran it again, got the same result, ran it again, and it's the same. So then I was talking to some of my nursery friends, and I'm like, this is so weird. And they said, oh, that makes perfect sense. Whoops. And the thing though is they told me is that all of these cultivars, Chanticleer, Cleveland Select, Stonehill, all these, they are all from a tree in Cleveland, Ohio, that apparently a bunch of different people drove by and said, wow, that's a gorgeous tree, I'm going to clone it. And so that is how those cloned. So the story is you can pay $10 for a Cleveland Select, or you can go pay $200 for a Chanticleer, and it's the same. That's what I learned. Okay, so let's look at what happens in the wild. So this is the Harris Benedict Botanical Preserve in our area of Cincinnati. And this is owned by the University of Cincinnati, I should say. This is the 71 freeway. This is the 275. This is in Blue Ash in Montgomery, Ohio. Just to give you, sorry, I should have given that to you first. This is Sycamore High School and Cornell Road going over here. So one thing you'll notice is it looks odd. And that is because in 1999, there was that tornado that came through. And tragically, it resulted in the loss of life of several people living in those homes, someone on the freeway as well. And so you could see what happened here is that the tornado touched down, actually went 3 ways, but it went that way. And so it just downed all of the trees. And so I arrived on the scene, so that's 1999. I came and started my job in 2002. And was told, hey, let's start this long-term study of this tornado site, which actually we've been doing, which is a whole different project. But what we did is we went through, we found a whole bunch of wild pears. We stopped at 102. And you'll notice they're actually in a weird pattern, and that's along the fire breaks, because at that point it's really hard just to get through all the brush. And so we just sampled the ones we can grab. So then what we did was we went around in the neighborhood and we sampled all the trees that we can get a hold of around there. And using the genetics that I told you about earlier, we're able to identify what type of cultivar that was. And so again, our goal is to figure out, are these wild plants hybrids? Are they mixtures of the other cultivars around? So you'll see a lot of these, especially those of you in the front and online, you'll be able to see this, that a lot of these are green, so they're the Bradford, which makes sense. That's one of the more common ones. There's a few Respires, these blues. You can see there's a few Aristocrats here. There's a Chanticleer over here, which I told you is the same as Cleveland Select. So we were able to figure this out. It was fun talking to people too and trying to tell them, do you mind if I take a leaf off your tree? And they're like, what are you doing? And I have to explain, and then they want to invite me into their backyard to diagnose all plant diseases. And I had to explain I'm a plant biologist, but not a plant pathologist. So this is what we saw. So essentially, a majority at this point, nearly 60% of the wild trees that we sampled were indeed F1 hybrids. That's direct hybrids between, and most of them were actually a Bradford and an Aristocrat that crossed together. So we're like, the gardening people were right. But the story doesn't end there. Remember I told you that when you graft something, you have the top part, that's the scion, and the bottom part, that's a whole different individual. So I was sort of unhappy because we didn't explain all of the trees. It's only 60%. We're like, okay, there has to be something else going on. So we started to think about this. There's cases where, in this case on the left here, you can see that the rootstock has sprouted. If you nick it the wrong way, or it will sprout. And then over here on the extreme right is a case where I'm driving down the road one day. This is near the UC campus. And I saw this weird looking tree and I had to stop because I'm a plant nerd. And when you look in the middle of it, you can see where the actual main stem had been cut down. So these are all root sprouts, big root bush. And so now the idea is, okay, is it possible for the bottom part of the tree, if it were to flower like it is over on the right there, can now that cross-pollinate with everything else? And so we did a project, and I grabbed my daughter to show, she's a little too excited about this. But this is, again, one of my neighbors. And you can see, I don't know what they did, but there's all these growths, and these are not saplings or anything. This is from the roots. And so you could see it just starts all growing up, and so it can be crazy. So we did a genetic test, and what we saw was that the upper scion is always genetically different from the rootstock. That's one thing. So, okay, verified that. And then we also found out that if you go to like Target or Meyer and they have the trees planted there, there's rootstock genotypes. I didn't think about this, but just like I told you how the upper part, a cultivar, you have like the Bradford and the New Bradford. There's also cultivated varieties of the rootstocks. And that makes sense when I started asking around. They're like, well, if you find a rootstock that's really good in Southern Ohio, you're going to use that a lot versus something that would be good in California. So that's what we found out. So then we went back to the Benedict population, looked at our data and said, okay, how many of those actually have a rootstock involved? And it turned out 17% of the wild trees. We're still missing a few. And so there's probably some other cultivars we missed. And so that's what we're thinking. All right, so getting back to the question, do wild populations result from cross-pollinations between cultivars? The answer is yes. And so in my lab, and this is, I should mention, this is primarily one of my graduate students who did a lot of this work, Nicole Hardiman. And so she was able to find that, again, wild populations do come from cross-pollinations. But remember, I told you it's among the different cultivars is the big problem, but also within one plant, essentially, a scion and a rootstock, if someone doesn't care for it properly and it's allowed to cross-pollinate, then you could essentially have a whole bunch of seeds produced and boom, it goes from there. So this is a funny one. So this picture that I showed you, this is again in Westchester. This is the Eagle Ridge subdivision. If you're familiar with that, off of right by the Westchester Library now. But there's all these trees that they plant in the subdivision, and you see all these wild trees around in the natural areas. And so I thought this was weird. And one of my neighbors who lived there said, hey, guess what? You have to go look at the codes and covenances of that homeowners association. And when you look, there was a section in there where they required that people plant a Callery Pear tree in their yard. Furthermore, it must be, if it falls, it's dead, it has to be replaced with a Cleveland Select pear tree. So, okay, that explains that. And this picture I had to take because how people prune their trees, it cracks me up sometimes. So the update was we actually went back to the homeowners association. We're like, you know those trees over there, those come from over here. And so to their credit, they removed that. And so that was a good thing, I think. Okay, so what I'm going to ask is, I told you about how seeds are produced, how they're dispersed, but then how do these wild populations actually really get going? How do they become established to the point where you have this big, huge mass of them? So what we wanted to do in my lab is to look at seed germination. How easily are these seeds able to germinate? So these are the fruits in late winter. And by the way, they've all shriveled and they are so hard to open, you have to use vice grips. So imagine this thing is going through a bird's gut. And so it's ripping up all this, it's just hard wood essentially. So you can pull out the seeds, then you put them in water, and sometimes we add a little sucrose solution, let them sit for a long time, monitor them, make sure there's no mold, and then you can count how many seeds have germinated after a period of time. So we did this, and then honestly, I put all the seeds in the refrigerator and I forgot about them for 11 years. And then I had another undergrad come, she's like, I need a project. I'm like, oh, I got these seeds. Let's see if they're any good. And so we did exactly the same thing 11 years later. Lo and behold, it turns out they're still alive. So in 2006, when these seeds are fresh, we did rates of germination. They were 82%. 2017, the germination rates went down, but 61%, I would argue, is pretty darn good. And then we also took those seeds and planted them, by the way. And so the survival in 2006, fresh new seeds just planted, those progeny growing is 92%. And then by the time several years later, it's 64%, it's gone down, but again, more than half of the seeds after 11 years are still good. And again, this is in a lab refrigerator. So out in the wild, the numbers might be lower, but this is just showing you essentially, if you take care and you move a bunch of these Callery pear trees from your field, essentially those seeds are still going to be in the soil and you might be fighting that problem for over a decade. So that's a concern. This is just another picture just showing we looked at different cultivars and looked at seed viability. And essentially it's all pretty much, well, I guess Stonehill is a little low and Cleveland Select, ironically, but they're all pretty good. They're all 40% or above for the most part. And then you'll notice like a whole bunch of these are similar to one another. And again, these are the 4 that are genetically the same. So, that matches. Okay, this is where we are today with Callery pear. So the first indications of it being a problem are really over in Glendale, Maryland. Now in Ohio, it's spreading like crazy. It's been spreading across the South. We start to see pockets showing up here and there. It's now over in Madison, Wisconsin. Many of these different pockets is not natural spread. It's not the birds flying over, to a whole nother state. Rather, it's people are planting the trees there, and now they're starting to cross, and then those fruits get out. So that's what we're seeing. Now today, we're seeing the expansion of Callery pear is going westward and also northward. And this is one thing with global climate change. We are seeing very different changes in the temperatures, especially in early spring. So we're anticipating it's going to be going up even further. It's going to keep moving. I told you about Callery pear and honeysuckle. We're seeing cases where you have Callery pear invading areas of wild honeysuckle, and they're actually outcompeting them and growing over them. So interesting. Again, both of these are from China. So now they have this whole new battle going on in North America. Now I want to just leave you with a few of the interesting things that have been going on recently. We started to see changes in what I call the spread of the wild pear. So remember, normally I told you it's along the roadsides. You're going to see that in a little bit. Blooming right now. But we started to see little babies of them appearing in the deep forest. And so here's an example of one of my colleagues, and this is in Martin County, Indiana. It's a whole bunch of saplings at this point, almost his height, if not taller. And so we were curious about this. The concern is this the beginning of a new niche where the species is now somehow able to move into the interior forest? And it turns out that the story is interesting in that it appears to be linked to the American robin. We've now started to see that the American robin is eating fruits of the Callery pear. Now, unlike the starling, which sort of hangs out on edges and on the roadsides and the telephone lines, the American robin will eat something, go deep into the forest, eat it, poop, fly back out, go back and do the same thing. So we think that the change in the behavior, if you will, of the Callery pear is actually linked to its seed disperser, to the bird behavior, which actually is rather interesting. If you've ever been in the forest, just to show you, that's looking down what the non-native Callery pear looks like. And oftentimes it's confused with the native black cherry. The difference, though, is if you see with the Callery Pear right here, the younger leaves have these lobes, usually like these 3 lobes. When it gets older, it loses that. And so it just has the entire leaf margin. There's a few difference in the leaf serration and also the thickness. The Callery Pear is a little thicker if you feel the leaf. But that's where you have to be careful. If you're going to go in and remove some Callery Pear, you need to make sure you're not removing the native species. All right. So I wanted to know, we have this Callery Pear problem, are there any natural checks on wild pear, any natural ways that the pear is being reduced? So one of the funny things, I don't know if you guys remember this, is a few years ago, there was all this thing in the news about this orange dust is covering, and they were calling it Cheeto dust, which I thought was funny. But it turns out that what this was from the Callery Pear. Another picture by Joe Boggs from OSU Extension. And so what happened that year, and we've seen it a few years since, is what's known as a cedar quince rust. Normally, this rust, as the name implies, is on cedar. Quince is like pear, right? And so we started to see it hit Callery Pear. And so this is what happened here. So you start to see these fruits, but instead of a normal fruit, like here's a normal fruit, it's going to have these like weird alien forms coming out of it. And so that's essentially the rust, and it's producing the rust spores, which is that orange material. And then if you look over on the right over there, you can see the normal fruits, but then further down, you can see those fruits that got attacked and they're dead. So I'm thinking, this is a way that's going to naturally reduce fruit production of the Callery Pear. A side note, it can actually also attack other related species. So this is a serviceberry in my yard, a native species, and it got attacked as well. So that can happen. But here's, again, me walking my dog around the neighborhood. And so in 2018, this is a picture I took showing you that it's a mess. There's all these pear fruits all over. By 2020, the same time, you can see there's barely anything there. So there definitely was a hit in the fruit production. So then I thought, that's the downfall of the tree. The next year it was back up again like crazy. So, oh well. The other thing I've seen are fall webworms. This is last year. This is in the fall. And again, I was getting all excited. Maybe it's attacking everything. Another picture by Joe Boggs. I think it was, I've only seen it on one tree. So finally, I want to ask, is the Callery Pear considered invasive in Ohio? And the answer is actually yes. And so Patricia had mentioned a lot of the work that we've done to this point. So again, we're talking about the Callery Pear and all the cultivars. So to give you a little history, with the Ohio Invasive Plants Council, in 2014, we listed that as invasive. There's no teeth behind that. That's just informal, not informal. It's formal, but it's an educational way to identify an invasive species. Back in 2018, though, it was listed by the Ohio Department of Agriculture, and we could talk about that more if you want, but they decided to ban it from commercial sale and distribution after a 5-year phase-out period. So that 5-year phase-out period was January of this year. So as of this year, it no longer can be sold in the state of Ohio or distributed out of the state. So if you go to a nursery or Lowe's or Home Depot and you see a Callery Pear for sale, that actually is illegal. And then people ask, what can you do? You're supposed to report it to the ODA. The ODA has plant inspectors who will then go and usually inform them that, hey, you can't sell this. And then if they don't, there's fees that can happen. So all cultivars no longer can be sold in Ohio. And the pear is also facing a lot of problems nationwide. I've just color coded this to see a few of the states. The red states are where it's already listed as invasive. Orange is watch list. And then you see a few things where some of the states like Illinois identify it as problematic, but because of its economic importance, they pull it off of the invasive list. So those things can happen. And Indiana is working on it right now. So the other thing I just want to tell you, lately, I have fun. And if you go online, you can sort of see this being sold. So here's Etsy. And so someone is trying to sell Bradford pear tree seeds. That's a lot. So they actually had to do a lot of work to get those seeds. If they look like the right seeds. For $2.38. So you can see things happen. Even on Amazon, someone wants $11.99 for 30 seeds. I love that. I'll give them 30. That's how I can make money for our department. So that happens. Okay, what I want to leave you with is a question. Is the invasive Callery pear bad for society? Now, I've been sort of talking about invasives being bad, and they do all these different things in the environment, they're bad. But I want you to think about something that's sort of interesting. And that is 9/11. So if you remember back when that happened, horrible tragedies, the Twin Towers fell. And what happened was there was one tree known as the survivor tree, that picture shown here, where it was nearly decimated, but it had a few leaves there. And so the people who were at the site, I mean, it was just a heart-wrenching, emotional episode, but they saw this tree still alive and they thought, let's see if we can save at least that tree. So what they did was they took that tree, and you can see it, it's in pretty sad shape, and they brought it to the Bronx to a nursery, and they babied it, and lo and behold, it grew back. And so now that tree has been planted back at ground zero at the 9/11 area there, and it's called the survivor tree. So that's what it looks like. You can see it's in pretty sad shape. It's all cabled and everything. This most likely is the Bradford, by the way. I'm trying to get a leaf from it, but I think it's a Bradford. So again, this is the site where you can go today. There's a really nice plaque talking about it's the survivor tree. At the end, they say this tree bursts into magnificent blossoms each spring, embodying a living symbol of resilience. And so people saw this tree, they were inspired. They're like, if the tree can survive this horrible thing, so can I. And so this was a really big deal. Here, people thought it was such a big deal that they started a survivor tree seedling program. So they send these trees, these seedlings, all around the world as an indication of the survivor, the resilience of the area. So I just want to leave you with this question. I don't have an answer, but how do we reconcile an invasive tree with its symbolic value? I don't know, but that's out there. And this tree has been made an inspiration for a number of stories. You can see a bunch of kids' books. You can buy these. And so what I want to do is I'm just going to leave it there. Later on, we can talk about preventing pears if you want. But I want to leave it there and also remind you that essentially we've taken a trip. So we've gone all the way from the early 1900s talking about the Callery pear in China, why it was brought to the United States, how it became really popular. A friend for many of us that have them in our yards, but now it's moved a little bit more into the faux area where we're trying to get rid of it. But again, the story is not clear cut because we have these cases where people attach a lot of symbolism to the tree. So I'm going to end there and let's see how we go.
You mentioned about economic impact, like in Illinois.
Yeah.
What is that? Is it because of the nursery trade or is it some other factor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It is primarily the nursery trade. Because if you think a great example is the ash trees. Do you remember when we had emerald ash borer? And so the nurseries had to suddenly just get rid of their stock. And so that cost them thousands, if not millions of dollars because they had to destroy all that stock. And so that's where if suddenly we say, hey, this tree's invasive, it no longer can be sold now. A lot of those nurseries, many of which are just mom and pop places, then are stuck. They lose all of that money that they've invested. And so that's one reason why with the regulation, we had a 5-year phase out period. And I will tell you, so I'm on the committee that made that recommendation ultimately, and I wanted a 1 year and other people wanted a 10-year. And so we sort of settled at the 5. But that's exactly why. Yeah.
You mentioned that they're self-incompatible, so they can't pollinate themselves. So what's pollinate?
Yeah, so the thing that's pollinating them, well, bees pollinate them. So the bees are flying all over, I left that out, but they're getting pollen from the other cultivars in the area. So what happens is if you live in an area and everyone's doing their thing, they love this tree, they're all going to plant, I don't know, Aristocrats. You get a new neighbor who comes in, their tree falls over and they're like, hey, I'm going to plant a Respire. Now that thing can cross with everything. Now everyone's going to start fruiting.
So it's the honeybee that's the main pollinator?
It's usually honeybees, there's native bees. We've seen some butterflies. I don't think they're very effective. No one has really studied like what is an effective pollinator. but I've seen bees just swarming all over.
Teresa, I have a
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
So, if one is getting rid of a Callery pear tree in their yard, you mentioned the issues with the roots and
Yeah.
all of that. So
Yeah.
how does one make sure that you've fully gotten it or best you can gotten it?
Yeah, so the best way, if you have an established tree in your yard, and even if it's like broken and fallen over, you don't want to just cut it and walk away because it will root sprout. So that one picture that I showed you. So what you really have to do, and I know people don't like to use herbicides, but this is one case where actually you really need to use an herbicide. And so when we try to remove these in that preserve I showed you, we'll cut them and then within 10 minutes, we apply a very dilute solution of glyphosate of Roundup. It's only about 2 to 5%. You can totally water it down. And you spray it right on the cut stump, and then the plant absorbs that into their system and it kills it. But what I tell people, and I do have, this is what I'm trying to show you. Oh, this is my thing. You can make them mad. So if you just mow them and you don't treat them, it's just a big bush. And so this is an example of my neighbor again on my walks, where they cut a tree down and then I'm watching it because I know they haven't treated it. And then you start to see it sprouting and you get a whole bunch of sprouts. Eventually they came in and they had to, what is it called when you stump grind?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, Eric?
I'm surprised by on that distribution map,
Yeah.
the relatively small amount of green that was on there. You think that there aren't pears in the white, in the counties that weren't marked green?
Yeah.
Or is it a lack of collecting or lack of observation?
Yeah, I think, so Eric was asking for that distribution map that we had. You'll notice there were a few little green counties, but there's a lot of white, which is true. So that map is Ed Maps, and so that's based on herbarium data. So you are the right person to ask this, but it is symbolic of collecting. So yeah, and people just haven't gotten to some of those places.
We had a related question from Pamela in the Zoom audience, and she wanted to know, does the tree grow west of the Mississippi? So again, is that a collection issue?
It's a collection issue. Yeah. So the question of whether the tree grows west of the Mississippi, it does. One of the things, like when I was visiting my sister in Reno, Nevada, we're driving around and you could see like planted Callery pears, and I start looking and then you could see the little wild ones popping up. So a lot of that is, yeah, people just haven't collected it, honestly.
And we have another question from Dawn who asked, what is worse for its effect in Ohio, honeysuckle or Callery pear, in terms of ecological and human impacts?
Which is worse? They're both bad. So it goes back to like, we need to know more. So amber honeysuckle, for example, we know there's scientific evidence that it has a negative effect on songbirds because how they build their nests, because of the branching structure, it makes the songbirds in their nests, the little babies, more susceptible to predation by raccoons and stuff because they can more easily climb up the amber honeysuckle versus something like a native shrub like spice bush is what they compared it to. Honestly, we don't have a lot of those like animal examples yet with Callery pear. I mean, I've been finding amber honeysuckle a lot. They're both bad. They're all bad. Yeah, I don't know if I can make a distinction. I will say though, when you talk to young kids, and young kids is where it's at, right? They think that honeysuckle is normal. And I've had people say, oh, it's nice and green. It's there, it's the woods. And I have to try to explain, no, it shouldn't be there at all. And so that's one thing we have to educate people.
I'm gonna vote for honeysuckle being one.
You want honeysuckle? Why? Why, Eric? Eric is saying honeysuckle.
Full spring.
It does.
In forest, it beats out very early.
Yeah, there is. So he's saying honeysuckle shades out everything and leaves out early in the spring. It's one of the, so it's out now. I mean, if you've seen that. There is evidence that Callery pear is allelopathic. So what that means is it's dumping chemicals into the ground like a good old honeysuckle. And that's a problem. I do have, well, George Utz in Cincinnati, in our department, I gave him some Callery pear leaves and he's been looking at spiders and mating behavior. And they do see differences in mating behavior of the spiders on the Callery pear leaves, which are thicker, versus maples and oaks. and it went in the wrong direction. So the spiders actually do better on the calorie. So I don't know what that means.
Well, thank you, Teresa. Or we've got some more questions.
One more hot off the press here.
Okay. Would not a commercial formulation of the quince rust be a better solution than Roundup?
Oh, that is interesting. Yeah. Now you gotta be careful, because now I'm going into like think about genetic engineering. That's interesting. The danger of that though is that the cedar quince rust also attacks a whole bunch of other native things. So I'm always worried about introducing something for one reason and then goes off on the other side. So I'd be careful. I like the idea. It's creative. I just don't know if I do it.
We have a lot of things with best intentions, including the Callery Pear. Well, you might have guessed there was a reason that I asked, what are you supposed to do when you remove a Callery Pear tree? Time for true confessions. I have one in my yard. It is slated for removal this season and will definitely happen. We'll take care of those roots too. Teresa, I'd like to thank you for once again, a wonderful program. The audience for joining us tonight, both the Zoom audience and especially the people that came in person. And also mention that programs like this are supported by members of the Lloyd Library. If you're a member, thank you so much. I see a couple that I know actually recently signed letters for, so thank you. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join, and you can find information on our website, or you could join in person. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.